The date is Thursday, May 28th, 2026. Something came across my desk and John actually commented how he wanted to get feedback or wanted me to talk about current events or current disasters. Right now, we're going to be talking about the tank rupture. I would qualify this as a disaster now that happened in Washington State on Tuesday, May 26th. It is the 28th. That's on the 26th. So this is actively going on. There's an active response going on right now. I'm going to say certain things, and I'm not going to say other things, and there's going to be reasons for that, and we're going to try to make this educational. Firstly, when you're talking about an ongoing disaster, historically, some members of the media have found it interesting or decided to go with the angle about talking about how effective the responders are being or commenting on whether or not the responders are doing a good job. This is generally a very bad idea. While there's an active response going on, you don't want to be commenting on things that decrease public confidence in responders because it can make things like evacuations more difficult. It can make things more complicated. And really the time for that is after sort of the dust has settled, as it were, and people's lives aren't in immediate danger. Then you can go back and review and look over that sort of thing. I haven't seen any reporting like that on this yet, but I just wanted to make that sort of comment because when you're talking about an active ongoing incident like this, where there is an active response, you want to be careful not to say things that will lead to misinformation or complicate matters or affect people negatively on the ground. With that in mind, we're going to be focused on teachables from this, and I'm not going to be inputting certain things that would sort of get in the way of the people trying to do the good work of helping people in the situation. For an understanding of this, all of my resourcing from this has come from basically a 5 to 10 minute internet search and from a CNN article that I was sent. So I have a very cursory view of this. I don't have a lot of information, but there still are certain things that you can learn from looking at an event like this. From what I can see so far, this is primarily to do with the pulp and paper mill, the pulp mill in Longview, Washington. As of the reporting I'm seeing, we have 11 individuals who are suspected deceased. I don't believe they've been confirmed yet. From what I've seen, it appears that rescue operations have transitioned from rescue to recovery. Now, what that means, because we've talked about like different phases of emergency management in here with prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. That's one use for the word recovery. In this instance, what they're referring to, when rescue workers go in to help people in a building, rescue operations are the types of operations where they assume that, or they hope that people inside are still alive and are struggling. After a certain amount of time has passed, the likelihood that someone has survived has decreased significantly, and they transition into what they call recovery operations, where they're not really expecting to find people who have survived. They're expecting to recover remains of people for the family to bury. It's a fairly dark thing to talk about, but the types of operations are slightly different. The sort of urgency is slightly different. And there's some reporting that things have transitioned to that. However, I would double check if that is the case because I wouldn't want to get ahead of myself and assume they've gone into full-on recovery operations if they are still doing some rescue. For most lay people, this distinction doesn't really make much of a difference. The reality is that emergency responders are largely going to be in control of when that shifts. You're likely going to be the people that are receiving this information and just kind of reacting to it. You're not going to have a lot of sort of agency in determining when the rescue organization decides that rescue operations are over. From what I see, that's happened. And basically, the individuals that they haven't found yet, that they believe to still be inside, are being presumed deceased because we've shifted, apparently, into recovery operations. So the total there, we believe, is 11. We've talked about it a bit before, but the Canadian Disaster Database categories for when something qualifies as a disaster here, for the size of this town, and especially given that the total number of expected deceased has gone over 10, this would be easily categorized as a disaster via my context. So this is the sort of thing that would sort of hit my radar. We've talked about that sort of thing in the past. So pulp and paper mills and chemical companies in general are actually their own disaster category. There's certain types of chemical spills and fires and the like that have their own special category zone in the Canadian Disaster Database because they are a sort of risk that society tends to respect and tends to think is significant. The reality is, to get most of the products and things that you need to make your life convenient, sometimes the manufacturing of those products involves some pretty dangerous stuff and some stuff that, when it comes in contact with the human body, doesn't do very nice things. So we have, health and safety legislation, hazardous goods, materials and handling regulations, and all these sorts of things in place to hopefully prevent these sorts of things from happening. Now, we don't know why this happened specifically. We know that there was a tank rupture, basically a pressurized container with chemicals ruptured, and then that caused what I believe was an initial explosion and then contact with hazardous materials. But pressurized tanks exist in any number of other industries. People who work in energy and fuel systems will be very familiar with propane tanks, with gasoline tanks. In farming and agriculture, you'll be familiar with ammonia tanks. We have pressurized gas. Your fire extinguisher is pressurized gas. If you pump up your tires using an air compressor, the tank itself is pressurized air. We use pressurized tanks in daily life. Anytime you're dealing with one of these tanks, there's appropriate safety and handling and things you should consider to reduce your risk of having a very bad outcome. In this instance, chemical plant has a rupture of chemical tank and bad thing ensues because the scale of one of these chemical plants is much larger than your at-home fire extinguisher. When one of these things ruptures, it's a, whole city big fire response and it's a much bigger deal. The scale's much bigger. But just for learning to kind of contextualize this to understand the hazard better, what you're thinking about fundamentally is container of thing that is pressurized, ruptures, and then a whole bunch of stuff happens. It's just a difference of scale. If you wanted to learn more about hazards like this one, I would look into learning how pressurizing gases works, looking into what sort of health and safety measures we have, what sort of hazardous goods and materials regulations we have. How does one safely fill a car with propane? How does one safely use sulfuric acid in a process? Things like that. Now, pulp and paper companies, speaking to the industry specifically here, have had a history of large-scale incidents. One of the more famous ones in Canada, and I'm not saying this is what happened here, but one of the more famous ones in Canada, just for learning purposes, was the pulp and paper company. I think it was Dundermount. No, I think the office is getting into my brain again. There was a pulp and paper company in Northern Ontario that had methyl mercury pouring into the river, which caused Grassy Narrows First Nation to have a poisoned river system for 100 years. There's a CBC News well-done journalistic piece called Children of the Poison River that goes over this whole thing. The point is that pulp and paper, the industry, uses a lot of hazardous materials because making paper isn't exactly simple. One does not just chop down a tree and manifest paper that you can write on. There's a whole bunch of chemical processes. This thing has to go, it has to be treated, etc. And for this reason, and because there's a history of the pulp and paper industry being involved in some pretty significant disasters, they're generally fairly heavily regulated, and they generally have, pretty lengthy safety things they have to go through. So think about how much paper you make and how often you hear about one of these things happening. Given how much paper there is, be it writing paper, toilet paper, paper towel, whatever, we don't hear about these sorts of things happening every day. So I would say that this sort of event is more of an anomaly than an assumed thing, but this is the sort of thing that can happen when some sort of process fails. Now, look, this is an ongoing disaster, and I just said process fail, and some people are going to assign blame to that, but back up a second. When you look at disaster risk reduction and when you look at analyzing disasters like this one, there is going to be a process failure somewhere, because if there isn't, then the disaster wouldn't have happened. This is more of like an academic way of looking at things. People will often say, hey, it was an accident, but from a risk perspective, accidents are impossible. There's no such thing as an accident. Ostensibly, from a risk perspective, if a random bolt of lightning were to randomly strike you, we would find a reason to justify how you could have prevented that by never leaving your house or something. When we look at this and say there was a process failure and that there's no such thing as an accident, we mean it in a very specific context, and we're not necessarily assigning blame. So just keep in mind that that's kind of what I mean when I say that. Now, what will happen with something of this size is there will be an investigation. They'll look at what happened with the materials before the spill. I'm almost certain that will happen. And then they'll try to find out what happened. But hopefully, what we look at in the future with this is we try to identify where there was a failure in the process, and then we look to fix that. And ideally, if this is actually a process failure or something that happened which could happen happen everywhere else in the industry, then this is something that the industry learns from, and the industry overall reduces its risk. An example of this, and this one is a bit more extreme. The example I'm about to give is an example where I would argue there was actual incompetence involved, which I don't have any indication of that with this case, but just so you can learn. The well-documented case of Chernobyl. So in Chernobyl, you had a nuclear meltdown that was caused by multiple layers of issues that were all process failures that were preventable. The product of the investigations into Chernobyl and the years of what happened post was a change of how all of the Soviet Union actually handled its nuclear program. So the entire industry changed because they realized that certain things were being done that should not have been done, and that was present in all of their plants. So we may learn from this that based on the way this ruptured, there was something that the whole industry is doing, and the industry will hopefully learn from that and go, hey, we better fix that. We may learn that there was a minor error that was a minor oversight that caused a chain reaction. Who knows, right? But hopefully the product of learning what happens is that we learn from it and then we adapt as need be. But if you're, looking at this video and you're curious about this sort of event, you can watch how it unfolds. Most of the information will be public through the news with something like this because it's so public. Elected officials involved will want to be seen to be doing the right thing or being as transparent as possible because the political ramifications of not doing so are generally bad. So most of the information for this you will likely get in public domain, and it will be relatively easy to get. But I want people to hopefully use this event in a positive way to learn more about how many hazardous goods we have in our society and how to use them properly and what's involved in doing this sort of thing. Because the reality is that this industry and many others like it do use a lot of hazardous goods, the sorts of things where if you come into contact with it with your regular person in an uncontrolled environment, it will probably kill you. So, it's good to know about these sorts of things. Some people do not really appreciate just how dangerous some jobs are and how sort of safe we've made certain dangerous things through extensive regulation. I know that some people are very pro or anti-regulation, but when it comes to the health and safety stuff, some of these things are there for a reason, and some of these things are very, very important. Once again, I'm not making the claim that deregulation caused this disaster because I have no information to indicate that, and that's not my point here. My point is that this is an example of a bad thing happening, and if this particularly motivates you, then you could use this as sort of fuel for better understanding the whole landscape so that you might work to help prevent the next one. Who knows? So far, this is a pretty interesting case. There isn't a lot of information that's public other than the presumed death total and the fact that it was a ruptured tank. From what I can tell, the community seems to be coming together, which is always good to see. If you want to know more about this sort of thing, I highly recommend looking into your local labor laws and looking into WMIS or any other sort of hazardous goods information. There is also actually a fun little book. So I'm going to go magically grab that and come back because I want to show you a fun little book and explain how that works. And we're back. So this is a really old copy of the ERG, the Emergency Response Guidebook. We used to give these out to people. You can get them for pretty cheap. You can get it for free online in a PDF. I want to talk about this because when it comes to hazardous goods in the workplace, there are a few things that people might not know. So the first, when the fire department, when emergency responders get there, usually it's the fire department that's going to do this piece because they're kind of the non-human hazard specialists. Not they kind of, they are the non-human hazard specialists. They'll have this little orange book, or they'll have some version of this little orange book in their engine, in their fire truck. And what will happen is when they get there, if they don't know the chemical, or even if they do, what they'll generally do is they'll look through the book and they'll find out where the chemical is in the book. And they'll open up to that page, and there's ways to learn how to use something like this if they don't know what it is. And the book will tell them what the basic hazards are for it, what the public safety measures are, how far they have to evacuate. Do they have to evacuate, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 3 miles, 4 miles? Is it, upwind, downwind? Is it water? It's going to give them basically the, in case of this, do this. So there's this really cool book that exists that you can find for free online that you can look up any chemical that you're interested in and be like, oh, there's this thing. I wonder what we do. Oh, go to this page. And then you go and then you read it, and that's what they do. Resources like this exist. If you're curious and you want to look this sort of stuff up, it's pretty interesting. They have this categorized alphabetically by name, ID number. So like, for example, if I want to look up hydrazine hydrate, if I have a spill, a leak, or an issue with hydrazine hydrate, I go to page 153 and I'm there, and now I can read, and I find out that it's combustible material which may burn but does not ignite readily, which tells me that, it's not going to just burn in open air immediately, but it can burn if you help it. It tells me that I need to wear full SCBA gear. So this is self-contained breathing apparatus. I can't let vapors touch me. This tells me first aid for it. Do I need to evacuate? Isolate spill or leak area in all directions for at least 50 meters, 150 feet for liquids, and at least 25 meters to 75 feet for solids. This is what I have to do for this specific type of substance. There's a book for it. Many businesses, if you deal with these sorts of hazardous chemicals, will have an MSDS, a material safety data sheet, or an MSS material safety sheet, or an SDS safety data sheet, depending on which era we're in and what we're calling it. But there's some sort of sheet or booklet of sheets or binder of sheets that you have for all your hazardous materials. It's a good idea to leave a copy of this binder at the exit of every building, or even better, on the outside exit of every building, and something that's sort of rain protected in an easily accessible location, so that when you evacuate, you can grab it and hand it to the fire department. It's much easier for a fire department, if they don't know what they're walking into, to take that sheet and go, oh, I see what you have in that building. And then it's safer for the fighters, the response can be more measured, etc., if they have access to that sort of sheet. If your business does that and you didn't know why that's there. If your business doesn't do that, maybe consider, adding a copy to that in case the worst happens, right? There's little lessons you can learn from this. Hopefully you learned something from this, and hopefully that town recovers as well as they can given the situation. Maybe something good can come of it, and we can learn something and look towards a brighter future. Have a good day, everybody.